はい、皆さん、どうもこんにちは。この動画は、もともと4月に上げる予定だったんですけど、いろいろあって、ちょっと忙しくなったりとかしてね、ちょっと遅れたんですけど、だからなんだっていう話ですけど、このオープニングでね、他に話題っていうか、話すことなかったんで、ちょっと言おうかなって思ったんです。はい、というわけで、本題に入りますか。
Hello everyone. This video is going to be in 3 main parts. So in the first part of the video, I plan to summarize my Japanese progress during the first 6 years of immersion learning, which was covered in my first 2 update videos. Then I'll talk about my experience living in Japan for over a year and the effects it had on my language ability. Then I'll go into what effect leaving Japan and living with minimal exposure to the language over the past 6 months has had. After that, I'll speak in Japanese for a bit about why I decided to learn Japanese in the first place. My relationship with the language has changed and evolved significantly over the past 7 years, so there's a lot to talk about. And through this video, you should get a decent idea of what you can realistically achieve with these methods over time. So let's get into it. Essentially, I discovered immersion learning around mid-2018, and since then I've been trying to incorporate listening and reading daily whenever I can, without focusing too much on actual study of the language. I should mention that although I started seriously immersing and incorporating the language into my daily routine in 2018, I had been learning to read the language for about 2 years prior to that. And by the time I discovered immersion learning, I could already read basic texts around probably an N3 level, but I still understood practically nothing when listening. From 2018 onwards, the amount I was immersing varied quite a bit depending on what was going on in my life and whether I had other commitments, but if I tried to roughly represent it visually, it would probably look something like this. As you can see, when I first discovered immersion, I was listening a lot as I was making sure to listen through my headphones whenever I could, even when I was doing other things and couldn't give it all my attention. I managed to make a lot of progress. I could understand almost nothing, save for a few keywords at first, but after 6 months or so, I became able to follow along somewhat to most of what I listened to, which was mostly YouTube videos and easier podcasts. I still found TV dramas and movies far too difficult. Around the start of 2019, the amount of listening I did declined for various reasons. Suffice to say, I became busy with other things. I ended up having more time to devote to listening after I started living alone in August of that year and didn't have many other commitments besides university. I was due to study abroad in Tokyo in 2020, so as soon as the summer holidays came along in December 2019, I decided to use the next few months to dedicate all my free time to improving my listening comprehension. My study abroad plans fell through because of COVID, but I continued this intensive immersive period until roughly mid-2020. This is probably when I saw the biggest leap in my listening comprehension. I became able to follow along comfortably to many TV dramas, which was something I had always struggled with. From late 2021 to early 2022, I was on the move quite a bit, but the job I had allowed me to listen while working, so I still managed to get in quite a bit of listening. This was also around the same time when I stopped playing the language in the background, which is often what's referred to as passive listening. I haven't done it since then. Around the end of March in 2022 was when I moved to Thailand, and after that, although I still consumed Japanese content almost every day, becoming better at the language was no longer a priority at the time, so the total amount of immersion I was getting declined. When I moved to Tokyo in August 2023, you can see that the amount of Japanese listening I was getting shot right back up again. This was especially true from September to March of 2024, when I was working in a busy Japanese environment. After I left Japan in November last year, the amount of listening I was getting dropped significantly. As for my reading, I was reading quite a bit after first discovering immersion, even though it was incomparably stronger than my listening at that point. Because at the time, I believed that reading was the key to acquiring vocab and sentence structures, which would then carry over to my listening as long as I continued to get enough listening input. But towards mid to late 2019, I started to realize listening is a skill that needs to be developed on its own without over-reliance on reading. So I started reducing the amount of Japanese I was reading from books until stopping altogether after I sat and passed the JLPT N1 test in December 2019. The second video I made on this channel is about passing the JLPT N1, so check that out if you're interested to hear more about that. Throughout 2020, I took all the time I would have otherwise spent reading and put it towards listening. I only really started reading the occasional Japanese book again around 2022, and I've been continuing to read periodically ever since. Although I have spent considerably more time reading English books compared to Japanese over the past few years. As for speaking, I never really spoke Japanese until mid-2019 when I signed up for a weekly language exchange with Japanese exchange students at my university, and that lasted for a few months. This was really my first attempt at speaking, and the result certainly wasn't anything to boast about. My speech was frustratingly broken and awkward. But even so, I did often surprise myself by using language that I never knew I had acquired. After that, I didn't speak until I made an account on HelloTalk, which is a language exchange app, and this was towards the latter half of the next year, 2020. And I use this app now and again to find people to talk to on the phone. By this point, I noticed my accent had noticeably improved, no doubt from all the listening I'd been doing. But I still had a lot of trouble expressing myself with anything beyond simple words and phrases. I didn't start regularly speaking until I found someone willing to call weekly from around September 2021 onwards. My speaking ability began to slowly improve more and more over time from there on. Living in Japan from September 2023 to November 2024 provided me with a lot more opportunity to use the language in my daily life. But in the 6 months since I've left, I've only spoken it a handful of times. Unfortunately, I didn't much enjoy my experience in Japan. The unsavory experience I had there resulted simply from a combination of unpreparedness on my part and plain old bad luck. Don't get me wrong, there were moments that I enjoyed, and I did meet some great people and make lasting friendships. The first time I lived abroad, before Japan, I got lucky. Things managed to work out, and all the right pieces fell into the right places. I naively assumed the same would be true for moving to Japan, but it didn't work out that way. And because I was trapped in a very negative mindset the majority of the time I was there, which seeped through into my 6-year update video, I didn't really have the motivation to go out and seek many experiences that would have involved communication and using the language. Most of the jobs I did didn't require a good deal of speaking too. This combined with mounting fatigue meant that I probably didn't make as much progress in developing my spoken ability in the language as much as I potentially could have. But since moving back, I've recovered and I'm feeling a lot better. And I have come to realize that if anything, it was certainly a very unique and valuable experience. Eventually, I'd love to talk more about my experiences in Japan and my travels in general. Although I wasn't using the language as much as I would have expected, I was still using it a lot more and more regularly than I ever had up until that point, so I did make progress. And even if the total amount of speaking time isn't that much, simply being forced to use the language on a daily basis still has a considerable effect because of the regularity of it. Before I moved to Japan, I was already comfortable understanding the language and I could hold a conversation, but I still felt quite limited in my ability to express myself, and I wouldn't have considered myself fluent. I talk about this more in my 5-year update video, which was made just a few months before I went to Japan. After living in Japan for a few months, because I was using the language more often and more regularly, I did notice that I became more proficient and got to the point where I would have confidently labeled myself fluent, even if that fluency is limited to certain situations. I already had confidence in my listening ability before going to Japan, so there wasn't much room for improvement. But I did notice marginal improvements in my listening ability, especially following along to groups of people talking. Since leaving Japan, the way I interact with the language has fundamentally changed. When I was in Japan hearing and seeing the language on a daily basis, a lot of my thoughts would be in Japanese, and if I wanted to search something on Google, for example, Often I would find myself instinctively searching for the answer in Japanese. Most, but not all, of what I listened to in my free time was in Japanese. Since moving back, it was noticeable just how rapidly the amount of thoughts I had in Japanese declined and disappeared almost entirely. And since there's no Japanese in my external environment, it's as if on some subconscious level the language has ceased to feel relevant to my life. So I find I no longer have motivation to interact with the language nearly as much as I used to. I've been listening to more English content than I had at any point over the 6.5 years before that. And on top of that, I've been putting my efforts into other things like learning a third language. Because of this, there are some days when I don't even get any Japanese input at all. But I still try to listen to the language a bit each day, and I've read a few Japanese books this year too. Returning from Japan felt as if a chapter of my life had closed. I'd spent so much of the previous 6.5 years with learning Japanese as one of my main priorities. And from the moment I started learning the language, it was always my goal to spend time living there. The year and 4 months I spent there felt like the culmination of my Japanese learning journey. I'd done what I'd set out to do, and it was time to move on. That's not to say I've given up on the language. It will still forever be a part of my life, sometimes in the background, perhaps in the forefront at other times, depending on my life circumstances at the time. I think all immersion learners eventually reach this point where the language stops consuming a big part of your life and recedes into the background. Even though I'm not interacting with the language nearly as much as I'd used to, my speaking ability has yet to decline to any significant degree. The last time I talked with my friend on the phone in Japanese, about a week ago, I could converse well enough, and in a way it even felt easier compared to when I was in Japan surrounded by the language. I feel like because the language isn't as much of a priority in my life anymore, I'm no longer burdened by as much pressure when speaking. There was always part of me that felt pressured to sound as good as I could and to avoid mistakes when speaking, otherwise I was some sort of failure. That's for the most part gone. Since I've left Japan and come back, I've been sleeping better, eating better, have more energy in general, and have mostly managed to extricate myself from the negative mindset I was stuck in during my time there. Because I'm more relaxed these days, I feel I'm able to enjoy the experience of chatting in the language without any unnecessary self-inflicted pressure and frustration with the gaps in my ability, and without overthinking the language I'm using and second-guessing myself to the extent I was previously. I'm still relatively comfortable in my ability for now, but there's no denying that my Japanese ability might start to decline considering the lack of input I'm getting. My guess is that my Japanese ability will end up in the same place as my guitar playing ability. When I was in school, I was obsessed with playing the guitar, and I used to practice hours a day until I became proficient within a few years. It was a very AJATT style approach now that I think of it. Nowadays, however, I don't play much, and sometimes I'll go months at a time without touching it. When I pick it up again after a long period, I'm more than a little rusty. But after a bit of practice over a few days, I'm mostly back where I was all those years ago. The muscle memory never entirely goes away. With Japanese, ideally I'd like to interact with the language regularly enough to, if not improve, at least maintain my current level. But even if my Japanese begins to fade from disuse, I know that that latent ability still lies dormant, hibernating in some hidden cavern of my mind, just waiting to be reawakened when it's needed once more. はい、ってことで、これからはちょっと日本語で話していきたいと思います。はい、この動画を作る前に、ちょっと日本語の部分で何について話せればいいのかなっていろいろ考えてたんですよね。で、その時思ったのが、自分がなんで日本語を勉強し始めたのかについてなんか話したらどうなのかなって思ったんですよ。っていうのはね、やっぱ多くの日本語学習者とは、ちょっと違うかもしれないですからね。はい。僕ね、時々その日本語を勉強してる人と話すんだけど、結構多くの学習者はね、日本の文化が好きだったりとか、それともね、日本のアニメが好きだったりとかっていう理由が 結構多いんですけど、僕はちょっと違うんですよね。最初はね、別に日本に興味があったとか、日本が好きだったっていうよりは、外国語自体に興味があって、子供の頃からずっといつか外国語を話せるようになりたいなっていう気持ちがあって、でじゃあ勉強しようって思った最初の頃は、じゃあ何語学べばいいのかっていうのが分かんなくてですね、最初は中国語にしようかなって思って、やっぱね人口がすごい多いから、あと、ビジネスもね結構、中国語を話せれば、ビジネスにすごい有利だって言われてるから、中国語にしようかなって思ったんですけど、あと中国語とか、イタリア語も結構好きだったんですよね。今でも好きですけど、いつかイタリア語を話せるようになりたいなっていう、気持ちは未だにあるんですけど、最終的に日本語にしたのが、えーっとね、高校生の時にね、僕結構映画が好きだった、今でも好きですけどね。でもその時すごいなんか映画を見てて、世界中の映画をね、いろんな国からのいろんな映画を見てたんですけど、結構日本映画にハマってた時期があって、で日本語を聞くじゃないですか。もちろん字幕付きですけど、映画を見てる時に日本語聞くじゃないですか。で、あれなんか日本語って結構なんか響きがいいなって思ったんですよね。その時結構、時代劇が多かったんですけど、昔のね黒澤明監督の時代劇とか結構多かったんですけど、その中に出てくる日本語、結構昔風ですけど、なんて言うんですかね、男性が話す時はすごいなんかパワーがあって、で逆にね女性が話す時はすごいなんか可愛らしいっていうか、やっぱなんかちょっと美しいなって思って、なんかその時からちょっとね興味が芽生えたんですよね。でも後になって大学に入ったら、その時通ってた大学が、その大学にその留学プログラムがあったんですね。日本の大学との、交換留学みたいなのあって、じゃあなんか、ずっと前からなんかいつか留学したいっていう気持ちがあったから、じゃあ今日本に留学するチャンスがやっぱやってきたから、あともちろん日本映画も好きだったし、じゃあ日本語にしようかっつって、日本語にしたんですね結局。でそれからその時はね日本についてほぼ何も知らなかったんですよね。日本の文化だったりについてほぼ何も知らなかったんですけど、ちょっと勉強してるうちに興味がね湧き始めて、今でもね今に至るって感じですね。はい。ここまで見てくれてありがとうございました。はい、次の動画で。